Welcome to another Boxing Squared live stream. A lot to get through. It was an unexpectedly dramatic weekend in the heavyweight division. And I don't say that to be disrespectful to the results, but I think there was a lot of things that went on that we didn't necessarily see coming. That left uppercut, which Johnny Nelson described as a so-called lucky punch, which, we'll get to. So Will in the building here, hello to you. But yeah, that was a beautiful shot. The dust is settling on the weekend. And we also have Kevin Kingpin Johnson. I mean, 2020 is crazy when Kingpin Johnson at 40 years old is on the front foot, throwing bombs and getting a knockout. That was also something that I wasn't able to watch live, but I will get to in this video. Also, Peter Kadiru was in action over the weekend. We'll talk about a couple of other results and goings-on. Tyson Fury, a couple of his different statements are sort of floating around, and obviously a few jibes towards other fellow divisional rivals. But there's a couple of other things as well, like Tony Bellew talking about Deontay Wilder having faced taxi drivers for 800 days, that Dillian Whyte was, so as a champion, but the 800 days of Deontay Wilder being a champion, that he faced taxi drivers. But when you look at the record, he only had 5 fights since Dillian Whyte was number 1 at the end of 2017, and 4 of them are Luis Ortiz and Tyson Fury collectively. But there's a few other things going on. Dave Alen says he would like to face Alen Babich. There's that statement from EC Boxing, which sort of, after Daniel Dubois with the replacement of opponent Ricardo Snijders, sort of the coverage of that sort of story just sort of fell away. So I'll circle back to that because they're not happy. David Adeleye is added to that card that Dubois is on this weekend. And yeah, there's a lot going on, so I thought I'd get in here for about a 45-minute stream because I've got work this morning, but woke up a bit early and there's a bit going on. And obviously Dillian Whyte, he's got to regroup. He's put out a clip, this is on the Matchroom social media channels, basically saying he's okay, he'll be back, and he's looking forward to the rematch. So getting back to the chat, so we've got 34 in the building, so thank you for joining one and all wherever you are, morning, noon or night. So it's just before 8 o'clock my time here in New Zealand. So Adam Fahey in the chat, IMPK, Marcus, Warren Jackson, Jim Blomqvist, Dion Boyle, Zib Indix, Callum, Tudor C, and G-Man. So hello to one and all. So Zib says that's what we want, real fights, not gimmies. And you have to give Dillian Whyte credit for taking that risk. I know that there were some people sort of saying it was a nothing fight, but I think some of those people either didn't like Dillian Whyte or didn't really understand that this still was a fight of divisional relevance, because there was a mandatory on the line, there was the interim title, was still 2 top 10 fighters. And sure, we can say, yeah, Dillian Whyte might have been overlooking Alexander Povetkin, looking to collect that pay-per-view money and move on. But, a guy as well-schooled as Povetkin, you can never write him off. And actually that sort of brings me to an issue that sort of I was a little surprised. One of the long-time subscribers and moderators, Unger, sent me a message last night. So some of the odds have come out for Dillian Whyte and Alexander Povetkin too. And it was still very short to Dillian Whyte. I think the odds that he sent through were something like $1.22 for Dillian Whyte and $4.50 for Alexander Povetkin, which was actually wider than it was on fight night for that fight, which Alexander Povetkin obviously won. So clearly some people are, or the bookies at least, think it was an aberration, and Dillian Whyte will start the favourite again for this fight, and a significant favourite. So I'm sure there's going to be some people who are going to be getting in on those odds when they're a bit longer. But I was surprised that they were that long, especially given the result of that first fight. But as we know, this is a case that it's heavyweight boxing. These things can happen. You can get caught with a shot, and you can be referred to just a few minutes ago in terms of Dillian Whyte sort of talking on the social media channels of Matchroom. He effectively said that he got caught with a good shot, but he's regrouping, he'll be back, and he's looking forward to the rematch. So he seemed in relatively good spirits, maybe a little bit humbler than usual, but you would expect that was quite a humbling experience. So Michael Johnson has joined the building. He says, "What up, Mr. Squared? Finally caught you." Well, I wouldn't normally be doing a stream this early my time, so it's just before 8 o'clock in the morning here. and yeah, it's on a weekday too, so it's a little bit unusual. But there was a lot going on, and part of the in the division at the moment. But part of the reason I wanted to have the live stream too was to also get in some of the results of other fights over the weekend, because last night, my time, I caught up with the Kevin Johnson fight against Joan Pablo Hernandez, and also the Peter Kadiru fight, which I wasn't able to watch live because I was busy making videos from the that Matchroom card where you had Babich and Winters, and then obviously Whyte and Povetkin. But yeah, Kevin Johnson, he was in suspiciously good shape, but also Kevin Johnson in 2020 on the front foot, letting his hands go. It was like, what is life sort of stuff, seeing that. I wasn't expecting that. But yeah, big upset there for Kingpin, and obviously Hernandez, and we'll come to this in a bit. He's probably going to fade back into the ether here. So Adam says he is backing Povetkin in the rematch. Kiwi 007, I should say. Good morning from COVID City. Where is that? Is that Melbourne, did you say? Victor says, not a surprise, Whyte's been down in every major fight except Chisora. And we were all talking about this in the lead up to the fight, that this wasn't necessarily a fight where Dillian Whyte was just going to breeze through, that he could be hurt, that he has been vulnerable in fights before, sometimes going a bit life and death, but he had been, getting through those moments and importantly getting wins. But in this case, he didn't. So BDB, he is in the chat here. He says, checking in, first time I've caught this live. Well, as I was saying, normally I wouldn't be live at this time, but we've got 50 in the building, wherever you are, morning, noon, or night. Thank you for joining me here. So BDB, if you don't know, is a heavyweight aficionado, has a great, the heavyweight division in terms of his coverage, and especially got a good penchant for the prospects coming through. Very good eye. So Stuart says, do you reckon Hearn actually wants the Undisputed fight, or was he hoping the Whyte versus Fury fight would delay it to protect Joshua? See, I'm not looking at it in that sort of lens, and I never have, because I don't think he was using Whyte as a blocker or anything like that. This is a company that's motivated by money. So if they could make the Whyte Fury fight before a Whyte Joshua fight, they would do that. I think some of the talk about using it as a blocker and other bits and pieces. No, they're looking at dollar signs. He probably thought Tyson Fury would beat Dillian Whyte, and then obviously that builds an even bigger fight for an Undisputed at some point, if it were to occur. But one thing I do want to say, I'll just get to one of the topics here, and this is related to Tyson Fury. He was going off in a big, show us, that you want to make this fight. We need to make Joshua Fury. This has to be a fight that we have to make, bloody, bloody, blah. But the irony with some of the comments, and remember, some of this is he's putting this out there publicly. It's part of the narrative that's, out there that he's trying to portray. But the thing is, that the irony of it all is he's got his stablemate Kubrat Pulev, who has a fight with Anthony Joshua next. So all this talk of Dillian Whyte got beaten, the path is clear for Undisputed, I don't know where that's coming from, because there is mandatories for Joshua right now. He's got 2 of them. And obviously Tyson Fury has to get past Deontay Wilder, a contracted fight that he has to take. So some of this is just, positioning in public, and it's just hype. It's just trying to paint narratives, that sort of stuff. Dillian Whyte getting knocked out, and some of the 1,000 days narrative and all the other bits and pieces Sky had tried to create and weave and build interest. That's all sort of fallen apart at the seams now. But it is heavyweight boxing. These things can happen. It was a great shot. Outraged because I didn't have the Sky commentary. It was the international feed that had Darren Barker and Chris Lloyd, which I thought for some of the fights, it wasn't great. I know some people have said they preferred it over the actual Sky commentary, but I still thought that it was at times horrendously biased and wasn't calling shots that were landing for certain fighters, the away fighters, as it were. But what was I getting at there? I was, kind of digressed off to, and I've forgotten to remind me in the chat. I'll get back to that. But yeah, Tyson Fury with this call out, make the fight with Joshua. We've got to have this now. We're still in a position where it can't really be made because of other fights that are, I don't want to say in the way, but we're already in the queue that they are taking. And have announced that are going to be held next. So yeah. I think people just need to dial back the rhetoric. And actually, Tony Bellew, which I thought was hilarious, super hilarious. Where are we here? So I'll definitely believe Dillian Whyte will still become a heavyweight champion of the world. 1,000 days he's been waiting to challenge for the WBC. 800 of them, Deontay Wilder's been champion. He was facing taxi drivers instead of facing Whyte. And that's all part of that 1,000 days narrative that Sky was building. But it's built on a house of cards. That statement there from Tony Bellew, it cracks me up, because if you look at the resume from Deontay Wilder from the time Dillian Whyte became the #1 contender, which was at the end of November 2017, so he became the #1 after Deontay Wilder had fought Berman Stavern. Not before, this was after. It was the end of November 2017. And Deontay Wilder has had 5 fights, 2 of them against Tyson Fury, 2 of them against Luis Ortiz, and 1 of them against Dominic Breazeale. Sure, that Dominic Breazeale one, not one we wanted, but we got because he was the mandatory. And this whole 1,000 days thing, I mean, that's built off, mandatory thing, which people keep sort of running out. Dominic Breazeale was confirmed as the mandatory through his win on November 4, 2017 over Eric Molina. Sure, dodgy circumstances to get there. We didn't need that fight. No one was calling for it. But that confirmed him as the mandatory then. And he was mandatory for 18 months. So Dillian Whyte was #1 contender, while Dominic Breazeale was the mandatory. So Whyte became the #1 after Dominic Breazeale had already secured that. So, I just want to sort of throw that back out there. But getting back to the Bellew stuff, so is he saying that Tyson Fury and Luis Ortiz are taxi drivers? Because that's what he is inferring, because 800 days, that takes in those 4 fights, which to me seemed hilarious. And I'm sure Dillian Whyte, if he beats Alexander Povetkin, it's almost up back to the title shot that he wants, but obviously he's going to have to wait significantly longer than he otherwise would have. But you still got to give him credit for taking that shot against Alexander Povetkin. It wasn't without risk. But clearly he got caught by a shot he didn't see coming. And the replay, because obviously Povetkin had been putting in a lot of good body work, which really wasn't being called on the commentary. But Dillian Whyte looked like he was bringing his hands down because he was expecting a body shot, and clearly Alexander Povetkin took advantage of that, and it was lights out. And got to say, what a stunning knockout. It's, I can't really repeat that enough. So I've just gone off a little bit of a rant there, so I'll just try to catch up in the chat. Apologies if I've missed your comment. So Kiwi07 says, I think Whyte is on Breazeale, Rivas, Kovnarski, Chisora, Povetkin, Hunter, and Chisora level. That's a good point to raise, because there is Tyson Fury had come out. This is another thing on my list, so I might as well tick this one off here. Come out and said, and I'll quote the statement. So he said, all these boxers, Joshua, Whyte, Chisora, Povetkin, all around the same level. They can take each other out. As for Whyte getting knocked out, regroup, back to the drawing board. It just shows what level they're at. Povetkin is 40 years old. And to some extent, I agree with Tyson Fury in the sense that there is a lot of guys who are on the same level. But I think often when people think about the division or where people are, often it's a tiered approach in your mind. You're sort of separating, okay, this is the top 3, this is the next 10, and this is the next 10 after that. But sometimes these gaps between these levels are nowhere near as big as people make out. And I think there is a case to say that Dillian Whyte is in that sort of top 10 chasing pack, and has been. But he had obviously been starting to separate himself through the number of the victories and sometimes the manner of the victories that he had been getting. But it's heavyweight boxing. If you're facing good fighters, you're not always going to win. So I think there's been a lot of people coming out saying that Dillian Whyte's a bum and he's no good and all this sort of stuff. And I just got to completely disagree with that. He is a good fighter. He has proven that. The resume shows that. He's got one of the stronger resumes in the heavyweight division. But also, if people want to say there's all the, especially some of Tyson Fury's fans, if they want to say all these guys, if Fury ever get any credit for beating them, he wants the credit, he wants to say he's the best, but then you're saying these guys are nothing. And I don't think there is such a big gap between the top few guys and then the rest. And as we've seen before, Andy Ruiz was able to upset Anthony Joshua. Got to remember, styles make fights, but also performances make fights. Because to me, Alexander Povetkin was looking at times in that fight. The hand speed wasn't as good as it has been previously. He's clearly on the decline. And I've had a few weirdos come to the channel trying to say that Povetkin was as good as he's ever been. And in this sort of narrative, or, I didn't see his hand speed being as slow. Are you sure you weren't influenced by the commentary? No, I was influenced by my own eyes. There was a lot of stuff that Dillian Whyte was seeing coming because Povetkin wasn't as sharp as he once was. There was good work in spots, but it wasn't like some, clinic that Povetkin was putting on or anything like that. I mean, I gave Povetkin round 1, and after that it was Whyte, and then obviously the 2 knockdowns followed by the 5th round stunning knockout. But that's heavyweight boxing, and that's why we love it, because it can be unpredictable. Nothing is written in stone. But there will be some who will try to take this now, especially promoters, and I'm sure David Higgins was licking his lips because he's looking to build a Joseph Parker and Junior Farr fight. He's going to be building up Junior Farr and say, look what happened to Dillian Whyte. He got taken out by Alexander Povetkin. But it's sometimes the context is key, because 2 top 10 fighters, Povetkin has been noted as being a hellacious puncher. Junior Farr not so much. So yeah, I'm sure there will be some who will hold this up and say, look, this is can happen in any and every situation. There is the scope for this to happen. Kind of just been getting off topic here and rambling a little bit, so I'll get back to the top of the chat here. So apologies if I have missed your comment, if it's gone, if it's come in and it's passed by. So if you really want me to comment on something, put it back in the chat at the moment. But Dion Boyle says Sky commentary thumbs down, and hearing, because I had the international feed, but then hearing that Johnny Nelson was describing it as a lucky punch, I was enraged by that, because that, if anything, this was the definition of a shot that Povetkin set up, and deliberately so. And from that position where he sort of dips down to the left, where he can throw to the body, or sometimes he'll come over with that overhand right. But this was a case where he saw that opening for the uppercut. Dillian Whyte brought his hands down, and the opening was there, and it just was a perfectly placed punch. And it didn't look like it had everything on it. But sometimes those knockout shots, with the timing and everything, you don't need to. But it was a shot he never saw coming, and yeah, he woke up obviously a little bit later. And curiously, it was a TKO for some reason, which I thought was bizarre. So Big Boys Boxing says Tim Zoon and Jeff Horn tonight should be a good watch. I thought that was tomorrow, isn't it Wednesday? Deb Yaka says, I watched this in Russian, no idea what was being said. Povetkin looked crap. Yeah, I mean, it's one of these things, he's a very skilled and technical fighter, and he's very deliberate in what he was doing, but he's lost a step. I don't know why people have been some weirdos coming to the channel trying to make out this was like prime Povetkin. Maybe that's to justify the loss. I don't know. Also had some people in a reaction video that I did, which was boxers reacting. And I don't know if you saw this clip, but there was a 6 or 7 second clip was doing the rounds on social media. It was from the Sky broadcast. It had Anthony Joshua, and Adam Smith was saying, we'll go to Anthony Joshua, his reaction, and Joshua was sort of, swaying a little bit side to side, and clearly to me, it looked like he was suppressing a smile or a smirk. But when I used a still shot of that in my video, had all sorts of people, very, very upset, suggesting that he was smiling or, suppressing a smile or a smirk. And they were basically telling me I was mind reading and all this sort of stuff, and then telling me what was actually happening, which to me I just thought was weird. I was just saying what I saw, what had been going around that clip. So, yeah, I mean, this whole thing that Anthony Joshua was devastated for Dillian Whyte, I'm not buying that narratives that some people are trying to sell. D. Obenuli says Whyte was picking Povetkin apart, bro. Dropped him in the previous round. He was overall outclassing him. And I've said this in the post-fight review. For the most part, Dillian Whyte was putting on a pretty decent boxing effort. He was looking better than he has in previous fights. And I know some people have been describing it, and Matthew Macklin on Twitter was describing it as a almost punch-perfect performance. It wasn't quite that, but it was certainly much more solid in terms of the boxing side of it than we've seen previously. But he was seeing a lot of what Povetkin was throwing. It was a lot of telegraphed shots that he was, and things that he was seeing clearly before it was thrown. And this is why I sort of say Povetkin is clearly on the decline, and I think he even lost a step since that Michael Hunter fight. But still, he's a good operator. He's dangerous. He's got power, and he showed us why you have to respect him. After those couple of knockdowns, you sort of thought it was going one way, that Dillian Whyte was, really getting into his groove and was wearing down Povetkin and probably going to stop him in the next round or two. Obviously, it didn't happen. So Victor says, if Povetkin was not 40 and you looked at his record, he is top 5. Easy. Well, I think, there becomes a point, though, where you're an aging fighter and you're maybe not performing as well. You've taken a couple of losses, and that's what I mean. At the point that he fought Dillian Whyte, he was still a top 10 fighter. I mean, somewhere between 5 and 10, and most people seemingly regarded Whyte somewhere between 4 and 6. Some people maybe a little bit higher. So it was a fight with divisional relevance. So it's not a shock that Povetkin won. And so it was an upset of sorts, but it's not a shock. Speak Your Mind Sports TV, he's talking to someone else there. Marvin says Povetkin cannot afford to come back to the UK for a rematch because he will need a KO again, as he will never get a decision on UK soil. Whyte is just a Del Chisora with less mileage. Well, I think that comparison with Chisora, I think Whyte has already proven he's a cut above, because he's got some, solid wins on his resume. He's got Robert Helenius. Obviously, Chisora fought Helenius. That was controversial, that result. But Whyte also has Parker, Rivas. You've got Chisora twice. There's Lucas Brown. I know I'm forgetting someone. Someone will probably remind me. But overall, his resume is very solid. When you look at Derek Chisora's resume and try to do a comparison, because seemingly people do want to do that, Derek Chisora doesn't actually have a lot there compared to Dillian Whyte. I mean, what's Chisora's best win? Carlos Takam? Yeah, and that was a faded version of Carlos Takam. So I'll just get down to the bottom of the chat here. True says 40 really isn't old anymore. Well, to an extent in heavyweight boxing, it is, because clearly you're not in your prime at that point. You're on the decline. But there's going to be some fighters who are always going to have the skills and ability to still compete. There's a lot of other fighters that rely solely on athleticism, and once that fades, they look bang average. But there is going to be some exceptions. We saw Klitschko was an exception, and Povetkin, a well-skilled amateur, Olympic gold medalist, and obviously he's got one of the better resumes in the past sort of 15 years in the heavyweight division. He's clearly proven himself. But we've seen in other fights he has looked like he's been slowing down and can't compete at the same sort of level. Because if this was 6 or 7 years ago, Povetkin would have been the white-hot favourite. But it's not. And I guess this is why the bookies are sort of thinking maybe this is a one-off, because those odds that have come out, they still favour Dillian Whyte in the rematch against Povetkin. But I'll get back to my list, and I'm just conscious of time because I'll have to wrap up in about 20 minutes or so because I've got work. I'll get back to my list because there were some certain things I wanted to cover. I'll just have a sip of water. So Kevin Johnson upsetting Joan Pablo Hernandez. I wasn't able to get round to do a post-fight review because I didn't catch it live, so I'll quickly cover it off here. But I was thinking when I was watching the first round or so, Kevin Johnson, obviously starting to do that cagey routine in the sort of first 30 seconds or so, but effectively being invited forward because Hernandez wanted to work off the back foot and move. And by the end of that first round, you sort of got the sense that Johnson was like, okay, I don't mind this. And what Hernandez was throwing didn't seem to have much on it. And by the end of round 2, Hernandez looked like he was starting to struggle, at least on the energy front. Mouth gaping, sort of sitting in the corner. I thought, yeah, he's not looking good here. Obviously, I knew the result going into this one, but I wanted to catch the whole fight. Johnson had him down in the 4th round, and I didn't think it was a particularly heavy shot that he caught him with. And there was also a couple of instances, I think it was round 5, where there was some suspiciously long sort of stops in the action a couple of them where it looked like Hernandez was certainly given a bit more time to recover, because one of them was there was a little bit of a cut over Johnson's eye. The other was Hernandez had lost his mouthpiece, which might have been deliberate, because after 4 rounds he looked pretty spent. There was nothing on the punches, and Kevin Johnson coming forward, piling forward, in 2020. I mean, this whole thing, we've seen Johnson basically being fed to journeymen for so long, being fed to prospects, and as this journeyman coming in, not doing too much, not throwing any punches. But you saw him tracking forward, letting his hands go. And it must be noted, he actually did hurt his left hand. He was talking about in the corner, after about round 2 or round 3, I can't remember, he said he had a cut or something. Something had gone in his glove and it had cut his hand, and he wasn't too comfortable. But it was actually the punch that finished Hernandez off was a left hook. But Kevin Johnson looked surprisingly good. Hernandez, obviously after 6 years out of the ring, coming back, headlining this SES card, he looks pretty terrible. So I'm not expecting to see him again. I think he will sort of disappear back into retirement. But on the undercard, you had Peter Kadiru, and I forget the name of his opponent, Muhammad Al something, but that guy must have been throwing his shots with about 8% power on them, because he was seemingly, technically okay moving around, but he'd throw out the jab or, a hook to the body or something like that, but it just had absolutely nothing on it. Some of the lightest punches that I've ever seen. But as soon as Peter Kadiru started to get a few shots in, and I was surprised he wasn't more aggressive in that first round. He sort of didn't take the cue that he could really start to, get on this guy and get some work away. But in the second round, as soon as he landed something, and didn't even look like it had full power. It was like a left hook to the body. It looked more of a glancing shot, and his opponent went down, didn't want to know. But I'm still not convinced about where Kadiru is going. Also, another topic. So I'll get through a couple of these things and then I'll get back to the chat for any questions and that. So, hold them off if you want me to answer something. But Dave Alen saying that Alen Babich would never beat him in a million years. To me, that's an interesting fight. We saw Shaundale Winters meekly, in some respects, not really turn up against Babich. And it wasn't a great performance by Winters, who's definitely shown more sort of heart in other fights. But Alen Babich sort of just rolling forward, just throwing punches with, savage intent, living up to the nickname Alen the Savage Babich. It was an impressive performance in a sense, but we can only give him so much credit because, it is at a certain level. But I think Dave Alen, who is a guy who is proven to be tough and durable, this 3-round strategy of Babich, because effectively after the fight he said, he's got this, 3 rounds or bust type mentality. It would be a really interesting fight to sort of see, well, what if it goes past 3 rounds? We've seen Dave Alen take all sorts of punishment, but he's a guy that can also throw back. And it's not like Alen Babich is a defensive maestro. So you could sort of see Dave Alen sort of working in that signature sort of shot to the body that sort of stopped Lucas Brown and a couple of others like Samir Nebo. You could totally see him doing some choreographed type work that he would just look to throw at some point and hope that it really lands and hurts a guy like Babich. But I guess whatever's going to happen with Babich in his career, because he called out Hrgovic, and I'll pick Hrgovic to beat him all day. Whatever happens, Babich is going to be in some fun fights. But I was surprised how low he was on the scale, 206. I mean, he could realistically easily make cruiserweight, but I guess he knows that the money is at heavyweight. So we've got a couple of other things. Daniel Dubois is facing Ricardo Snijders this weekend, so I'll do a little bit more coverage later in the week. But a little bit of news with that. So David Adeleye has been added to the card, so that's happened just in recent days. But this EC boxing statement, so the original opponent, Eric Pfeiffer, so he was not happy at this whole Ricardo Snijders thing. So initially there were some comments by Errol Seelan, the head of EC Boxing, to Boxing Scene, and they said they were going to come out with a statement, and Pfeiffer would too. So the Pfeiffer statement was not much. He basically said on Facebook, I'm not much for statements, blah, blah, but I'm ready to fight anyone. But in terms of what went up on the EC Boxing website, much more scathing, in line with those sort of Boxing Scene comments that came out last week. But He just said that, this is the statement from Errol Seelan, the statements of Queensberry Promotions are all untrue. We provided Frank Warren and his team with all the necessary documentation, so there was no problem in that respect. What is much more serious is the fact that no one in England has responded to our calls and messages for a few days now. Finally, we wanted to clarify final matters. The fact we now had to learn from the media that Eric was simply swapped for another boxer is an absolute naughtiness and clearly shows was for a dishonourable businessman Frank Warren. From now on, we will no longer work with him. And then he went on to say Eric has kept fit throughout the corona period. It has worked like never before in the last few weeks. In its present form, it would have become a danger to Dubois. But now all the hard training was, as all the sparring rounds were, in vain. Eric was stolen this chance. We at EC Boxing will now do everything we can to ensure that Eric gets a big fight soon and can prove to the boxing world what is in him. So yeah, that was the statement from them on the opponent swap, so the official one on their website. So yeah, I mean, the whole situation was bizarre. And the rationale from Frank Warren, which they put proactively before even telling these guys. So they, from what Errol Seelan has said, they didn't get any contact from Queensberry about this fight and about some sort of, paperwork issue if there's a scan hadn't been provided. So they're saying it's all untrue. And you would think that even at about 10 or 12 days notice, if there was something missing, you could certainly in 24 hours to 48 hours turn it around and get it over the line. But they're saying they've been ghosted by Frank Warren and his company. For what purpose and why have they, brought Snijders in here? Because I don't believe the whole narrative that Seelan's painting there, that Pfeiffer would have beaten Dubois. At the point these were announced, we were pretty clear on what this was. These were interim opponents and effectively tune-ups for Joyce and also for Dubois. I have no doubt Daniel Dubois, a fit and healthy Dubois, beats Eric Pfeiffer at this point, or any point. I mean, Eric Pfeiffer's got the greatest boost in his profile in his career that he could have ever hoped for being associated with this fight. But now, because of what's happened, and it seems weird, it makes you wonder, well, what's gone on? Is there a little injury to Daniel Dubois or something that's happened that they're just like, well, let's de-escalate the risk here? There was a little bit of risk because Pfeiffer was unbeaten, decent amateur, but we can't overblow what he did as an amateur, or we can't overblow what he's done as a pro because he hasn't proven anything in the heavyweight division at this point. So the whole thing was super, super weird. And I'll just check on the other things on my list to see if we've covered everything. So need to wrap up in the next 10 minutes or so. I think we've pretty much gone through everything. So if there is something you want me to respond to, now is the time to drop it. So Sebastian says Triple D should fight a live body to fight. Well, yeah, this does nothing, I think, for him. I mean, they're sort of saying this is an opponent, and Frank Warren saying it's a solid test. I mean, it really is. It's laughable. Ricardo Snijders' record is like a complete mirage. He's a cruiserweight. And as I noted on Twitter, Daniel Dubois might have been trolling Joe Joyce recently, saying that he was in the amateurs, he beat up kids as an older guy who was in the amateurs fighting, 18, 20-year-olds. But now Joyce can come back and say, well, you are fighting guys like this guy who's a cruiserweight. And obviously we know some people do actually, buy into that, and they will be sort of trolling Dubois for doing so. So Mackenzie Daily Betting Tip says Salita Boxing Squared. I'm not sure what that's in reference to. Organic Fitness says, in my opinion, it was arrogant for Whyte to get rid of Tibbs in such a crucial moment. Tibbs would have kept him grounded, but he must learn from this. A novice, as Whyte calls himself, cannot have a novice corner. Well, there's got to be a lot of raking over the coals of the performance and the strategy and other bits and pieces. But I have no doubt, and I said in my, it was the opening piece of one of them in my preview video, that I believe Mark Tibbs would have had a more safety-first strategy. That the Rivas and sort of Derek Chisora 2 sort of strategy of using a bit more movement and, just trying to get these guys, take the snap out of the punches, make them work a bit, chase you around the ring. I think he would have done a little bit of that. But clearly after he knocked Povetkin down twice in that round 4, he thought that, you know, it was starting to come to an end, and he got pretty comfortable in there. But he was holding his feet from about the second round or so, because in the first round it was cagey, they were having a look at each other, but then he started to get comfortable. And obviously they'd talked about the strategy that they wanted to implement, and it wasn't quite the same as, you know, say for example against Joseph Parker, where it was more rough, tough, rugged. Whyte wanted to box with him, and for the most part he was having a lot of success. But people will be questioning, should he have split with Tibbs? They were 11-0 together. It's going to be a question, and people will ask what will happen in the next sort of few months. Will there be a change to the training setup? So D. Obernouli says Frank Warren didn't want to risk Dubois. But yeah, I mean, I don't think there was a lot of risk there. I think it was an appropriate test at that point. I mean, we've seen other sort of prospects go through fights where, you know, in the last year or so, of a similar sort of caliber. I mean, I think F.A. Ajagba against Ali Erendemirezyan, you know, that was a pretty good fight. I mean, a lot of people were on Ajagba at the time. He didn't stop him, and they thought he was getting a bit hit too much. But if this is a case of thinking, well, actually Dubois probably would have won, but maybe there would have been some moments that he didn't look great in, and maybe it wasn't going to be a good advert for the Joyce fight. To me, that, you know, seems like it's working against Dubois in the way that he's been built so far, because there were some fights like I thought the Kajanu one was a good test at that time, and the Gorman performance, he showed he was clearly ready for better opponents, but then it's devolved into the likes of Fujimoto, Tete, Ricardo, Snijders. You know, these sort of fights do nothing for him. It's not the sort of activity that's going to give him much of anything heading into a Joyce fight. I think a Pfeiffer fight would have been much better. At least he probably would have got some rounds in. He probably still would have got the knockout and the win, but maybe he wouldn't have looked perfect, but he's still, you know, raw to some extent in developing. He's not meant to look like the finished article at this point. G-Man says, Finland better not cross those guys. They might find a horse's head in your bed. Darren says he's an up-and-comer. Yeah, he absolutely is, but he also needs on the way up to have certain tests and seasoning, because if you get to a certain level and you haven't had some of the rounds in the test that you need, you don't have that experience necessarily to cope with it. I mean, we've seen guys who've fought at a certain level and then they've taken massive steps up and come up short. True says absolute naughtiness, love it. Yeah, that was something from the because I actually covered that partly in a Patreon video just over the weekend. That line did crack me up. IMPK says, what do you make of David Hayes suggesting what Whyte was robbed of a 10 count? I think that is absolutely ludicrous. I mean, given the state of some of the commentary, I'm surprised that someone in the Sky commentary didn't suggest that Whyte slipped. TopHeavyweights.com says maybe Warren got the other opponent cheaper. Yeah, that's a possible outcome here. And there have been some people saying, oh, well, you know, it's 10 days notice, what do you expect? They had this guy on standby for weeks. They've had him training in case they needed to bring him in. So don't try to feed me that narrative and, oh, you know, what can you expect in a couple of weeks? I'm sure he probably did come cheaper than Pfeiffer, but I don't think that Pfeiffer would have been getting paid all that much either. Remembering a guy like Mikhail Wallish only got 20 grand to fight F.A. Ajagba. So I can't believe that Pfeiffer and Wallish were getting paid, you know, massive sums here either. I mean, they knew that their role was to come in and try to do something, but effectively make it look good for as long as, you know, they were in the fight. I mean, Wallish seems to have that down to an art now. Pfeiffer, as an unbeaten guy, maybe he was looking a bit more at this as an opportunity that he can make his name off this fight, but I don't think he was going to win this fight, and I think it's silly if people suggest that he was really going to. So Jake says, do you have a heavyweight that is not the best, but you just like for some reason? Mine is Wok. I mean, I think there's quite a few heavyweights that I like sort of following, that I know that maybe their ceiling, especially prospects, I know that their ceiling is probably limited to some extent, and maybe they're not going to go all the way, but I just like watching them fight, even at the lower level of the guys that they're coming through against, because they're fun fighters. Arslanbek Makhmadov, he certainly comes to mind. Martin Dorfler says, have you ever tried to contact Frank Warren or Eddie for an interview over the phone or Zoom? You deserve to get an interview with them. Over the course of the last 3 years of having the channel, I've approached both of those a number of times to just get on their press release lists and never heard a peep or nothing back. Joe says, I think Warren was thinking more about the arranged Joyce vs Dubois fight and didn't want Dubois to have a possible grueling fight so close. See, that's the thing. I'm not sure it would have been a grueling fight. I think it might have been competitive for a few rounds, but I think Dubois would have ultimately worn down and taken out Eric Pfeiffer. I've no doubt about that. D. Obenali says, Otto Wallin is the second best heavyweight, or is Fury a bit of a hype job? Otto Wallin is a guy that's about top 30, in my opinion. I don't think he's done really anything more to sort of prove that he deserves to be higher up the ranks. And there wasn't anything I saw in that Kaufman fight that made me think, yeah, this guy is a top 10. His promoters have been sort of saying, this guy is the real deal, yada, yada, yada. And I guess going back to an earlier thing with Fury saying a lot of these guys are on the same level and, you know, referencing their different performances. Well, Fury didn't look fantastic in that fight, and people will sort of say, oh, well, it was the cut and other bits and pieces, which, you know, factored into the fight and the way that it played out, but he was still getting touched up early by Otto Wallin early in that fight, which obviously opened up those cuts. They were from punches. I mean, I think some of the gap in the way we perceive the division sometimes, the differences between the fighters and where they're at and how far apart they are, it's not as big as we sometimes think. And as we know, styles make fights, performances make fights. So Philip says, I've just joined the chat. I thought Whyte was getting hit too easy by Povetkin, even though Povetkin was slow. I mean, Povetkin was certainly landing some hellacious body shots, and there were some good jabs, and I've said before, it was like a mirror. They were sort of doing a lot of the same sort of work, and you can sort of argue at different times who was getting the best of the better of the exchanges. Obviously, Whyte started to get into control of the fight. But yeah, Povetkin was slow, but Whyte, he has always been somewhat easy to hit. But when he does work that jab, he was looking pretty good there. David said Hearn should not be allowed to put a rematch clause into contracts for all these fighters. It's not fair. Well, that's just some of, you know, what it is. Whyte, for this fight, was the A side. He was giving Povetkin the opportunity. They'd selected Povetkin as the opponent. That's just what happens. And Hearn's pretty, you know, known for doing this. They protect themselves in their position. If something goes wrong, at least they have the rematch to try rectify and remedy and hopefully get a win in the second one. So Dion says, watch that time B squared, work soon, have a good day people, much love. You probably already left, but thank you for joining the chat here, Dion. Yeah, I better keep an eye on it. I'll go for another 5 minutes or so. I'll try to catch up here. Luke says, people talking up Pfeiffer like he has been a boogeyman boxer. Yeah, and this is the thing. I mean, hardly anyone had heard of him before this fight was made. It was only sort of in the last year that I've actually started compiling a folder on him and some different training clips and other bits and pieces. So I was well aware of who he was, but I'm, you know, sort of realistic about where his position is in the division right now. The number one prospect in heavyweight boxing was going to deal to him. So Zib says, I'm not interested in hypothetical fights. This is why a lot of boxing fans are moving to the UFC. Well, I think part of it at the moment is we're getting talk of a lot of fights, but not a lot's happening. This was the first fight, Povetkin and Whyte, where there was some divisional relevance. So 113, I should say now, in the building, wherever you are, morning, noon or night. Thank you for joining. I hope you're doing well. Mackenzie Daily Betting Tips says he made some cash on the weekend. Povetkin's last weekend predicted it correctly, Povetkin KO. And those odds for the second fight, some of them have come out, seem pretty wide again, and there's a lot of value to be had on Povetkin again. So Will says when Whyte fought Brown, he stayed nicely on the outside. That was a good boxing display. I definitely think we'll see Whyte being a bit more strategic and cautious in that second fight. L-Dog says robbed of a 10 count. Yeah, that is just, ridiculous. I mean, Dillian Whyte, was he asleep for about 20 or 30 seconds? I mean, there was no way he was getting up for that. And I heard that Johnny Nelson also sort of threw Dillian Whyte and Joe Frazier into the same sentence, which, Johnny Nelson's been on a roll, sort of saying it was a lucky punch. Obviously, back in 2018, saying that Tony Bellew was more technical than Alexander Usyk. Some of the commentary has just been so bad, it's not. And I think it's worse since boxing's come back. And Philip echoing that sentiment, saying Adam Smith is so biased, it's pathetic. Well, I was watching on that card, that first round of Pursoon and Taylor, and they didn't call one punch for Delphine Pursoon, and I was just like, what's going on here? I mean, I expect that there was always going to be a bit of bias and for the home fighter and that, but it seemingly has reached like next level stuff. It's gotten so bad it's not funny. So Speak Your Mind Sports TV says, what do you think the chances are for us to see Wilder versus Fury 3? I believe Wilder will take the fight because if he doesn't, his stock will plummet. What do you think? Or I fully expect that this fight is happening. I don't see the sort of absence of Wilder on social media or in public as a bad thing. I think that's a deliberate strategy, and they're trying to keep him, focused and dialed in for the job at hand. For whenever the fight happens, when it's made, probably depends on fans to some extent because of what Bob Arum sort of, we need fans, we need the gate, yada, yada, yada. It's a big fight. We can't leave the money on the table. Deontay Wilder's not turning it down because what's his cut going to be? $20-25 million? Why would you walk away from that? And if he can just make some adjustments, he will feel that he'll still be in the fight. I think Fury goes in a raging hot favourite for good reason, but Wilder and his team, they're going to rebuild him mentally to believe that. Obviously some of the excuses show some of the way that they're looking at it, trying to explain it away. Some of it's been a bit delusional with some of the, stuff that's been coming out from certain people making excuses for the loss. But if they can be honest with themselves and even just improve on certain things, they'll think that he's still a chance always with that power. So L-Dog says, morning squared, smash the like button. Yes, please. Hello to you too, L-Dog. Debiaka says, pennies count when you're frank. Well, that could be true, but if you're BT and you've got a certain level of fight that's just gone down to, a very, sort of scraping the bottom of the barrel, remembering this is a cruiserweight who's had, I think, 2 fights in his career at heavyweight, the last of which was a year ago, and his record at cruiserweight was pretty pedestrian. If you're BT, why would you want that? But it's always good to see Dubois back in the ring, but I don't think they're doing him any favors. Are they just hoping that this highlight reel knockout that's going to happen is going to build more interest? Because the thing is, though, it hasn't seemed to have worked to the same level as other fighters. But some of that's also tied in with Daniel Dubois' sort of level of personality and the number of interviews. He doesn't do enough interviews. He's not in the media enough. He's not, his profile is lower. He does the business in the ring. But the outside stuff, in this day and age, a smaller world, social media and all this sort of stuff, it counts for a lot. You think there's a lot of heavyweight boxers, to some extent, have built part of their name and reputation via social media. So, if I was BT, though, I'd be pretty raw at Frank Warren for this happening. And especially because this was the guy they had as the backup. They lined him up several weeks ago. Why couldn't they have lined up a better backup? And I don't want to hear there's only 10 days notice, what can you expect? They lined this guy up weeks ago. Geez, the chat is moving quickly. So Delroy Booth, and apologies if I've just skipped down to the bottom here. Delroy Booth says, rank the British boxing commentators. Number 1, Johnny Nelson. Was there something missing from that first comment, as in worst or most biased or something like that? G-Man says, Sky needs a whole new commentary team, someone objective and unbiased. Sometimes it's, you expect a bit of bias for the home fighter in that, but why not just call it as it is? Sometimes you're seeing punches land, you're like, oh, this, that was a good shot. It's just silence. Or it's like, oh, that, Shannon Courtney showed a good chin or something like that. And it's like, you're not even going to acknowledge the punch, that was a clean shot. Come on. Will says, it's funny after a loss, fighters are written off. Things always change if they avenge their loss. Yeah, I don't see this as a situation that Whyte lost, that he was exposed or anything like that. He's proven he is a good fighter. He's worthy of he is a top 10 fighter. And as he said in his social media clip that's up on Matchroom social media channels, when you're fighting guys like this is sometimes it's going to happen. You're going to take some losses. And I think we just need to, there's this reactionary sort of environment from some of the boxing fandom that if you lose, all of a sudden you're no good. But also boxers have this thing where they'll trash another boxer, but if they face that boxer, they'll want all the credit for beating them. But if you call someone a bum and say that they're no good, how can you get the credit for beating them? How can you be called, the greatest in the sport or something if you're basically saying that guy was trash to begin with? It just never makes sense to me. So Bill says, Whyte really doesn't like those uppercuts, becoming a familiar problem for him. Yeah, well, there is a pattern emerging now. Obviously, Rivas dropped him. Anthony Joshua took him out with an uppercut. And now Povetkin too. So Benjo says, Whyte has long arms, should never have been in uppercut range. Well, part of it, because I was watching it on slow-mo a number of times, he was expecting Povetkin to hit him to the body, because he started to bring those elbows down, and obviously the hands came with it, and clearly it was a bad move. But, Povetkin, because he had been throwing some hellacious shots to the body, Whyte obviously wasn't liking it, expected it, and obviously there was an opening which was taken advantage of. So Easy says, keep it up, Boxing Squared. Good night from Aberdeen, Scotland. Good night to you. Boxing says, I don't see Pursoon lose. I thought that was a pretty close fight again. I thought that the 98-93 card from, I think it was Victor Lachlan, I thought that was pretty terrible. I didn't think it was, because there were some close rounds, but I thought, 6-4 either way or a draw. Yeah, I mean, I didn't think it was outrageous. I felt more strongly about that first fight. TopHeavyweight.com says casual fans wouldn't know the difference between the two, unfortunately. Debiaka says Paulie just became available, best of the best. Yeah, I do like his commentary, but some of his controversial statements out of the ring certainly haven't helped his cause. Delroy Booth says, I wish Dave Alen could speak properly so he could get a sweet commentator job instead of getting hit in the head. Yeah, do you want to see Dave Alen versus Alen Babich? See, the thing is that for me is a really interesting fight, especially at this stage for Babich. We know what Dave Allen's about, but if it goes past 3 or 4 rounds, Dave Alen could be really in that fight. I think for the first few, Babich would just be teeing off, trying to get him out of there. But, yeah, I don't know if it can be made, because I'm sure Dave Alen will ask for too much money. I don't think there's the interest that he'd really get the sort of check that he thinks he deserves. So Philip says, if you ever see an interview before the last Fury fight, the Sky Team were nothing short of pathetic kids. There is no one close to Carpenter. Just say it as it is. This is the thing with the commentary. I mean, I expect some level of bias, but just tell me, tell the fans what's going on, because what you end up having, and because, most people who are here watching or listening to the stream, you're following boxing to such an extent, you know what you're seeing. And you know when something should be called and it's not being called. You see it with your own eyes, what's happening. You're probably loosely scoring the fight. You might even be writing something down or some notes or, who won which round. But some of the, the casual fans who aren't, following things as closely, they get completely sucked in. So then all of a sudden they think, oh yeah, this person was dominating the fight. And sometimes you can kind of go, what? You scored it, 8 rounds to 2, but sometimes it can be like it was razor thin. I just don't understand why the commentary, and this is not just a Sky thing, just in general, it just seems to be so bad right now. Joe says Babich versus Wardley. Yeah, I'm not sure that they'll end up making that fight, just because they're in the same stable. I think Dillian Whyte will look to sort of push them along on their own journeys for as long as possible. G-Man said even Pursoon herself said Katie won. Yeah, she was quite gracious in defeat this time. Obviously, she was pretty disappointed the first time. Like I say, I didn't certainly feel nearly as strongly as the first fight, but there were a lot of rounds where, besides the cheerleading commentary, Katie Taylor might land a few nice shots, but Persoon, with the pressure, the ringcraft, she was the aggressor. Sure, she was missing a lot of shots, but she was landing a lot too. And, it sort of comes down to what you like too. I didn't think those other two scorecards, I think 96-94, I didn't think they were unfair. I mean, I could have seen a draw 96-94 either way. I wasn't unhappy with that result. I know some people aren't. So Eddie says Babich versus Nick Webb. That would be a decent fight. I think Babich probably beats him. Lubak says the commentary for Joe Smith Jr. versus Alvarez was poor. That was a good fight from Joe Smith. Yeah, he looked pretty good in that. Speak Your Mind Sports TV, and remember, he does have his own YouTube channel, does some great live streams. He says Paulie is a great commentator until he gambles on the fight. Not to mention he's someone like Teddy Atlas and exposes too much about the corruption in boxing. Therefore, he's a risk. Paulie's good though. Well, I mean, just because he is different to the others, he separates himself. Fish says Babich out in September. L-Dog says Babich versus Hrgovic is an awful fight. Hrgovic will crush him inside 3 rounds. I think, yeah, Hrgovic goes in a strong favourite for that. I'm sure there will be some people who would have been sucked into that, but there were times in that he was so wide open it wasn't funny. And Winters, there was that one moment of the second round where Babich swung and missed wildly, was out of position, and he could have started to throw a few punches to a guy who couldn't defend himself. And he just let Babich spin around and just meekly sort of fell in and clinched. And I was just like, what's going on here? Easy says Whyte was in control. However, Povetkin is better skilled and shouldn't be slept on, no matter his age. Yeah, well, those skills, even though the hand speed and things, yeah, he's slowing down. He's not as good as he once was. Clearly, he's still a guy who can compete at a high level. And I said this all in the build-up, that this wasn't a foregone conclusion, that I wouldn't be shocked if Povetkin won. And in my preview video, I said, was this going to be the sort of step too far, because Whyte had been vulnerable and been hurt in some fights. And apparently it was. Apparently it was that step too far. Eddie says Babich versus Hemiahio. It'll be interesting to see with the pandemic and everything. Some of these guys who are in farther-flung places, like here in New Zealand where I am, Hemiahio, etc., what are they going to be able to do for him? Because I can see, and I spoke about in a Patreon video recently, so my Boxing Squared Patreon, patreon.com/Boxing Squared, there's going to be this sort of knock-on effect for the heavyweight division, that some of these guys are not going to get fights, they're going to be delayed, but it's going to be this whole knock-on for the whole division. Guys getting title shots, guys just in their development, everything's slowed. You're going to see some guys in their 30s. Some of their prime's just going to ebb away because the matchups won't be there because of different factors, because of what's going on. So it's 8:50 here. Technically, I've got to be at work I'm working from home today at 9 o'clock, so I've got to get my computer set up and some other bits and pieces. So I've got to wrap it up. But 128 in the building, so I thank you one and all for joining the live stream. We'll be back again. I'll try to come back on Friday with another live stream. But thank you very much for joining. We'll see you soon. So thank you for the support again. And I don't say that enough sometimes. Yeah, appreciate